monthly meeting of the Boulder County Regional Opioid Council. And we have a few excused council members, Commissioner Levy, Maria from City of Boulder, and Miranda from Town of Netherland. And I will go ahead and pass it over to you, Kelly, for our usual opening.
All right, sounds good. Let me go ahead and just share my screen here. Oops. Here we go. So can everyone see my slide deck?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, great. So just to kick us off with our usual meeting agenda recap and our virtual meeting guidelines. So as a reminder, this is not a public hearing. There are members of the public invited to attend and listen in today. And if there are any burning questions or comments or feedback, we do welcome those to be put in the chat. However, we won't be including those comments or responding to them in the course of the council's conversation today, and they will not be a part of the public record. So with that in mind, our meeting agenda for today, we're going to start with a discussion of the innovation grant that is a new opportunity put forward by the Opioid Abatement Council at the state level at the AG's office. We're also going to have a quick presentation from Indira Gujral from Boulder County Public Health on one project that we could potentially put forward as recommended program for that innovation grant funding. I'm going to give a recap of our initial work and conversations with our facilitation and evaluation subcontractor that we've talked about in the last few council meetings. That's going to be helping us with community engagement and strategic planning efforts. I do also have some additional feedback from BioBot, as well as our opioid operations group in terms of the continuing conversation on wastewater testing for fentanyl. And then Robin's going to lead the council in a reflection of this group's work today, what is working, what could be better in the future, etc. And then we will close out with items for the good of the order. Okay, oh, there we go. So again, this is an opportunity that was just put forward in early May. I think in our April meeting, we had some information that this was coming, but not a ton of information about what it was going to look like yet. So did want to just flesh out that understanding of what this opportunity is. So this is, again, put forward by the Attorney General's office. This is a funding opportunity that looks very similar to the infrastructure grants that we have discussed in this group in the past, in that it sort of sits outside of the regular funding stream for the allotment of dollars coming to each region. These dollars are sort of a held, that part of that 10% that's held back from regional allocations by the state, specifically for the purposes of launching these grant opportunities that look a little bit more like traditional RFPs, RFAs, and other competitive bid processes. So the Opioid Abatement Innovation Challenge, as it's called, the purpose is really to support new and emerging approaches to combating the opioid crisis and generating implementable solutions. And also to encourage ideas that are sort of new and emerging, maybe don't, have sort of the backing or the evidence base quite yet. We've talked a little bit about that in our operations group. What's it going to take to really start to elevate new and innovative ideas as well? And so this is really an opportunity that the state's put forward for regions to do that. So the target focus areas of this funding opportunity, they look pretty similar to the approved purpose areas that we've talked about, those 5 approved purpose areas, and all the projects and programming that sort of fall within those categories. So prevention, harm reduction, treatment, recovery. There's some additions in this that are not included in those 5 approved purpose areas, so additional call outs for this innovation grant. Care coordination and build out of the care continuum, behavioral health services primarily in the criminal justice or law enforcement space, so anywhere along that sequential intercept model. And then also just a note, since I know we did have some interdiction tools and technologies that were funded in our first round, interdiction tools are actually excluded from this particular funding cycle, so those are not eligible for the innovation grant funds. And then technological advances in data or infrastructure. So just a few more nuts and bolts on the funding opportunity. The deadline for responses to the request for applications is at the end of June. There is up to $4 million available in this funding period, and there's sort of 3 funding tiers or buckets that applicants can apply for. They can apply for one of the following 3 tiers within the 2-year budget cycle. So there's a small funding opportunity, a medium, and a large funding opportunities with, or excuse me, opportunity with corresponding sort of caps on what those funding requests can be. Also similar to the infrastructure grant, collaborations are incentivized. So the AG's office has been pretty clear and consistent, both with the infrastructure conversation and now with the innovation grant dollars, that they're really hoping to see regions either partner among programs within the region, partner across regions, potentially neighboring regions getting together for an application, and then also really hoping to see these recommendations come with, these applications come with letters of recommendation from a region's regional council. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any general questions on that before I hand it over to Indira to intro some opportunities that they're thinking of putting forward for funding. All right. That in mind, Indira, if you don't mind, I'll just keep driving. So just let me know when to change slides.
That sounds great. Thank you, Kelly. So I'm Indira Gujral. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Division Manager for Communicable Disease and Emergency Management at Boulder County Public Health. And over the past year, since January of 2022, we've had an interdisciplinary group from across the county that's been working on the fentanyl response. And we've identified some areas as collectively as a group that we think might be a good fit for this AG Innovation Grant. And so, as Kelly mentioned, the focus of this challenge is intentionally meant to be broad to encourage ideas and solutions that maximize the impact of the state's dollars. And the intent of it also is to accelerate progress with innovation to combat Colorado's opioid crisis. And so one of the things that when I think about innovation and is that, you know, innovation isn't necessarily always change management. It's definitely a creative process that helps to bring people together to build kind of a larger collective vision. And you don't always have that vision very in the beginning. You're building it, just like scientists when they're trying to go to the moon or do something like that. They are working in a creative space. And so I do think that this is an opportunity for us to leverage our existing relationships to work in a creative space, because the challenges that we have before us are kind of large and deep. So the second piece about an intervention is that we definitely want to leverage existing best practices. So when I worked in healthcare, I was part of a healthcare solution, a healthcare system that won the Malcolm Baldrige Award, which is the National Quality Award. And what you learn about that process is that you start with best practices and you say, how can we do better? Next slide, please. So when we take a look at the 10 evidence-based strategies for preventing opioid overdose, this is from the CDC, these best practices are being implemented in Boulder County. We are targeting naloxone distribution. We are offering medication-assisted treatment, not only in our healthcare systems, but also in our jail. We are providing academic detailing. We have done that in the past. We haven't done it for a couple of years, but that was something our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Urbina and Jamie Fells led with our healthcare systems to get everybody up to speed on how to support people who are struggling with addiction. We've started to eliminate those prior authorizations, so that's good. We've seen we don't necessarily screen for fentanyl in routine clinical toxicology, but it is something that we have talked to the state health department about as part of a health alert network to get more physicians doing that. We have Good Samaritan laws. We have not naloxone distribution in treatment centers such as the criminal justice setting. And so we've done a lot of this, and then we have the third oldest syringe access program in the country. So it does feel like we in Boulder County are doing a lot of these best practices. Next slide, please. But the challenge is that our drug landscape is really changing. And I think these past few years have really shown that, in 2016, I'm just going to do a little historical piece. We dealt with the rising rates of opioid addiction. So we started our substance use advisory group. We joined the national opioid litigation, right, as a county and as a community. We worked hard to make sure that our partners were supported with harm reduction. And we've really adopted a lot of these best practices, but unfortunately, it just may not be enough. We may not be able to stop the flow of drugs into the community. We're starting to see new and different drugs, these designer drugs, and we really do need a different approach. So we believe that the changing landscape means that we need to consider doing more targeted intervention and engaging the community in being part of the solution. This is not something government can solve. The community has to be involved. And so we have 3 strategies that we're proposing for this grant application. One is to build a comprehensive data surveillance system for opioids, fentanyl, xylazine, and other drugs. And the problem that we have is we do not have the internal infrastructure needed to build a robust data surveillance system to monitor data. We're really pleased with what that Commander Goldberger has done with the Sheriff's Office with getting law enforcement to enter data into ODMAP. And we do at Public Health have syndromic surveillance capabilities, but most of our data for public health, we have to wait a year for all those vital statistics data to come in. So we look at ODMAP as a really nice opportunity for us to develop and build a plan with partners, including helping to bring in some of the paramedic partners and emergency departments on board. And this data becomes real-time data that we can use to do things like spike alerts to notify the community when we might be seeing tainted drugs or new drugs or a bad batch of drugs within the community. Our second strategy is really around having a community trainer, a dedicated community trainer. So one of the problems that we're having is the harm reduction program is a grant funded program, and the demand from the community for harm reduction and naloxone training is super high, and our existing staff cannot keep up with the demand for the community. In addition, some of the trainings that are done are not evenly distributed across the county. And so as a result, we have some disparities in pockets of areas that are not receiving that training. And we feel that we need to start building a training plan that targets adults and works with the business community and parents. So businesses who serve priority populations, parents that we're trying to reach, and building kind of a larger awareness about not just harm reduction, but also access to naloxone. In our third strategy, we want to enlist the Substance Use Advisory Group's Community Engagement Work Group to develop a larger community response. We believe that we need to have community champions. We need to reach out to business communities. We need to consider the annual Harm Reduction Summit for providers and partners and open to the community to talk about the changing drug landscape and to be very transparent with the community of what we're facing. This is also an opportunity to coordinate all of our vending machine placement based on the data that's coming out of ODMAP and making sure that naloxone is placed in specific areas so community members can access it, as well as just being present at community events. So that's kind of our overarching strategy. And then the last slide I wanted to share is just about who is our focus. We can't do everything for everyone. So our focus is based on what we call a priority populations framework. So we recognize that some individuals and groups are at greater risk for negative health outcomes due to their social or economic position within society or other historic systems of oppression, and that can limit their access to services. And so because of this increased risk of overdose-related harms and death, we focus on naloxone training and access for the following priority populations. So these are people who use drugs, explore drugs, recreationally use drugs, parents of youth and young adults who use drugs, the unhoused, people who are criminally and justice involved, and service providers of priority populations. We also recognize the systemic oppression of people of color who use substances, and so as such, we prioritize Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as individuals with language access challenges. So this is kind of our equity-based framework for implementing these strategies. And that's it. Next slide. I'm open for questions or comments or concerns.
Indira, can you,
Thanks, Indira.
so, sorry, I was just going to ask a quick question. Can you speak a little bit to who participated in the development of the grant proposal?
Well, we haven't written the grant proposal, but this was all developed by the larger fentanyl group. And that group, we did a little bit more well, I should say Commander Goldberger, Allison Bailey, Georgia Babat-Picos, and I did a little bit more of and Trina Fates at Community Services. We did a little bit of a deeper dive on that community engagement component. But we will be, once we get approval from the ROC, I think our goal is to then share with everyone our plan, just to make sure all the rest of the partners are supportive of it.
And who are the partners?
It includes the school districts, representatives from the school districts, the University of Colorado, the Sheriff's Office, the DA's office, Boulder Community Hospital. I know I'm forgetting, we just talked to Mental Health Partners, and we've been talking with them. Also Denver Recovery Group and the treatment side. And there may be another partner I might be forgetting, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Indira. Are there other questions? Oh, Susan, your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Indira. So my curiosity is more about kind of connection to the different groups. So you're talking about SUAG helping with some of this community outreach, and there's overlap with members of SUAG and the operations board for the Opioid Council, correct?
I believe so. I don't
Yeah.
serve on the, go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, there are, I know Georgia, Nico, Commander Goldberger, excuse me, and Trina. I believe Allison Bailey as well. So there's some crossover, yeah.
And I'm just curious, and actually, Kelly, this is maybe a question for you, and maybe Jim too, is with what we have supported as far as the opioid funding, is there anything else like this? I don't remember any kind of plan or anything that this would duplicate.
If I'm going over the catalog of current programs that we funded, nothing's coming to mind as it being duplicative. So I know that, well, maybe I'll back out of that. We did fund SWAG. So I don't know if that is in any way sort of duplicative. We did put some funding forward to support SWAG and the personnel that facilitate SWAG. So that might be a little bit of duplication there, but SWAG does so much. Their sort of reach is pretty broad. And so I think having that work group specifically hold this part of community engagement, I think is unique to this proposal, I should say.
Thank you.
And I would just say, to your point, Susan, it would feel to me, if this gets funded, that strategy 3 should fall into the larger region plan, so that it doesn't get separated out by an effort under SUAG separate from what we're trying to do together. Because I think these efforts could really contribute to the larger regional effort, but that the third strategy feels like it should be kind of brought into the ops group with some support and guidance by the region council.
One other thing I'll mention that just came to mind, that we did fund in this past funding cycle are those vending machines that Indira mentioned that have harm reduction supplies and Narcan available. So those would be part of, as she mentioned, strategy 1, I believe, which is just sort of using data to analyze where the best placement for those machines would be. I don't want to speak out of turn there, Indira. I think I heard that correctly, but that would be another tie into some of the current strategies that we're funding.
That's right. So the ODMAP data is really vital for us to take a look at where we need to resource the community in terms of naloxone. And so we have a lot of partners who want to do the vending machines, which is great. And so Boulder Community, for example, I think CU now wants to do them. MHP wants to place them. So Georgia is bringing together like a comprehensive group that's going to look at the data and help make sure that we're placing them in areas that are high demand or where we're seeing a lot of overdoses. And so that will, and to identify any, spots that we might be missing. And I would just say that, that's really important because we want to meet people where they're at in terms of the community and making sure that they have access. So we don't want to leave any spots, without a place to access them. And I should mention also Clinica is also going to be placing them in their spaces as well.
Indira, could you talk a little bit about what this looks like budgetarily? Like where are the resources needed to do this the various pieces of this work?
Well, we just started building a budget and it was probably around 550,000 maybe. A lot of money is going to go out to the community in terms of, just like paying members or providing stipends for members of the community engagement work group to participate. So we have active participation. And then also just making sure that we have, a community trainer. We need to hire a data epidemiologist to handle all of the data surveillance system needs that we have. We're going to need that regardless of, whether we get this grant or not. That's something that we're going to need in-house. I can't remember exactly what the budget is, but I want to say it's between like 550, something like that. It was in that mid-range that Kelly shared in the beginning.
Indira, there's a question in the chat from Wendy Schwartz from the city of Boulder, who's sitting in for Maria. It says, Indira, can you clarify regarding all the partners you just listed off? They've been part of the development of the items on the fentanyl proposal you just listed off, correct? And I think the answer is yes, right?
The answer is yes. The difference is that we applied for a harm reduction expansion grant back in, I can't even remember, I think it was January. And we were notified that we didn't get it because they needed to fund other communities for that harm reduction grant, which is good. I would say, Wendy, that all the partners are aware that we're applying for this grant. They just may not be aware of the strategy 3 build out that we're wanting to do. And that's something that once I get approval here that we will take back to the fentanyl group. Although I will say, we just had a meeting with some of the school districts and CU and MHP was there and they're aware of the strategy 3. I think it's probably just the district attorney's office that I haven't shared yet. I hope that helps.
Other questions for Indira about this funding opportunity and application? I might hand off to Robin for a second. I'm not sure if we want to do sort of a formal recommendation or approval or how you want to kind of process this moving forward.
Sure. So I think first I would ask if any of the other council members, if they're going to put forth a grant for this specific resource. And just remind the group that we in the past had a couple brief conversations about how should we vet proposals when these infrastructure or innovation grants continue. So I'll take it the answer to the first question about anybody else anticipating proposals is no. I think it would be great to have a formal motion to support the proposal. And Indira, we can turn that into a written letter of support.
Great, thank you.
I can move to support the proposal.
Thank you, Susan. Could I have a second?
I'll
Second.
second it.
Thank you, CJ. Any more discussion or questions before we move the vote? I think this approach, Indira, is really going to serve the work of Barack in addition to the community. So I think it's a nice match.
Thank you. I think that strategy 3 is definitely, we're going to build a bigger vision as a group, and I think it's really going to support the work across the whole county with all the municipalities. So I'm open and excited to see where this takes us, because I think that without community engagement in the substance use issues that we're facing right now, it's going to be really challenging moving forward. So I appreciate the support.
Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. Either with the icon or with your real hand. Anyone opposed? Okay, it looks like the motion passes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And one thing I'll also offer, Indira, I wonder to what extent it might be good to have conversation about any way that the operations group can help in planning or executing part of this. I just want to make sure that that group and their expertise is plugged in to any, sort of way that makes sense for you all. So maybe you and I can just touch base on that offline and see what the opportunity is.
That sounds great. That's not a problem, and we could figure out a way to put that into the grant application itself. I think the tie-in will make for a stronger application, and leveraging those community voices and having them lead in that space. I think it's going to be great.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Seeing no more questions on this topic, I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. Okay, so I just wanted to provide a quick update on where we sit with our work with Third Horizon Strategies. So as a reminder, that is the subcontractor that we have decided to contract with to lead some of our broader facilitation and evaluation efforts in strategic planning over time. So sorry for the dense slide here, but we did have our first call with Third Horizon Strategies last week and just sort of talked to them about the general vision of the work and what we're really hoping to achieve with their assistance. So as a reminder, and we've talked a lot about it in this group, we did move with that shovel-ready approach because of our time limitations in the first round of funding, but knowing that we wanted to kind of come back and broaden that, that understanding of what our region needs from more of a landscape view. So we had a little bit of conversation about what that might look like. And also just being realistic about what we can accomplish and within when. We know we do want to develop an entire strategic plan, but we also know that we have some timelines already upon us in terms of submitting our next funding recommendations in December. And so had a little bit of conversation about how we might weave in this broader strategic planning effort while also developing some really tangible near and long-term goals to make sure that we have at least our process framework complete and sort of pinged to some priority areas by the time we have to put out RFPs or begin a competitive bid process in the fall of this year, or end of summer, really. So we had some conversation about the main phases of work that the group would be taking on. Process facilitation. So we let them know that we're really looking for tools, strategies, how we can plug into some known principles or best practices for thinking really critically about our regional strategy. Tools, methods to vet all funding opportunities against those priority areas. So developing something like a framework or a matrix, some sort of standardized methodology through which all of these opportunities are vetted and all of the programs that are applying for those opportunities are vetted. And then building out the operations group to represent more subject matter expertise that spans both the tactical and now strategic nature of the conversations that are going to be folded into that operations group to hold. Community engagement. This is another sort of big body of work that we've expressed is of top importance to us, increasing our ability to be transparent about this process as we learn more about our standardized process, our timelines, any competitive funding opportunities, making sure that all of that is tying into the community in a thoughtful way. So really early and often was our answer when they asked, how much community engagement and when. So really starting the conversation on what it looks like to launch community convenings or develop some ongoing feedback mechanisms throughout this process. And then evaluation. This is sort of that third chunk of work. So really, where this stands, this one's a little bit further out sequentially, just as we start to develop our priorities first and foremost. But really, this work will be going on and woven in along the entire sort of work trajectory. So, for now, we've asked for Third Horizons to plug in at the state level. We know that the AG's office hosts those monthly learning forums. And the June conversation, we believe, is going to be dedicated to program outcome reporting. So the settlement regions will be coming forward to talk about how they're envisioning outcome reporting, developing KPIs or key performance metrics for their funded programs, et cetera. So that's really where we sit in terms of those big three bodies of work that they're going to be taking on with us first and foremost. And then we had a conversation about logistics and timeline. So we talked in this council maybe 2 or 3 months ago about what our known milestones are. So if you can recall, knowing that every September we have every September, we have an understanding of what our funds are going to be for the following year. Every December, we submit a plan. And then every start Q1 of the following year, we disperse those funds. So talking through with Third Horizon, what does it look like to layer that on top of all of these different strategies and methodologies that we're trying to put in place, to be conscious of the fact, like competitive funding timelines, to be conscious of the fact that if we need to have recommendations forward by the end of the year, what's the timing through which we need to back out and start an RFP process. And then also wanting to fold this group more formally into discussions both here and with the opioid operations group once the work gets a little bit more fleshed out. I'll pause and see if there's any questions about our work with Third Horizon. Or Jim, anything you wanted to add from that conversation we had last week?
No, I think this is a really good introduction.
So one thing we were thinking of is potentially, if we're at a good space to kind of expand on this by June, maybe having some representatives from Third Horizon present at the council. If the council agrees, that would be a good space to welcome them in and talk a little bit more in depth about some of these plans. Okay. Lexi.
Thanks, Kelly. Just a question related to a recent suggestion of the benefit of a landscape analysis. I'm assuming that first bullet point is that in alignment with that suggestion, but I just want to clarify if that's part of the expectation of their work.
Yeah, correct. So I believe Nuria's input earlier before the meeting. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So part of that is getting an understanding of what's already going on in the space. What have we already figured out and investigated through other efforts like community health needs assessments, some of the roadmap planning. And then also this group did specifically call out to another one of Nuria's points, being really conscious of what other funding opportunities there are. So having that view of, when a funding request comes forward, is it in fact the most appropriate space to fund it through abatement dollars, or is there another pocket of funding out there and available that might be a better fit for that programming? So there was some conversation about that for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Right. So I wanted to revisit some of our ongoing conversation around testing of wastewater for traces of fentanyl and other opioids. As a reminder, we've had this conversation in the last few ROC meetings, and now we were also able to have this conversation in our last operations group as well. So I did want to update on some of the questions that this council brought forward in our April conversation, as well as some feedback that the operations group has had subsequent to that. So as a reminder, this conversation is about the opportunity to test the Boulder County wastewater system for traces of fentanyl, with the global goals of potentially targeting resources and initiatives to areas where there might be spikes, and also to potentially evaluate long-term impact of any interventions that we're putting abatement funds towards. So again, we had that conversation in March. April, we had the conversation again, and illustrated or brought forward a couple more specific questions that council members wanted more on. So there was conversation on the testing capabilities. How can we really figure out illicit versus prescription use? More on local context. There are some conversations percolating between these testing agencies and players within the state. So CDPHE, what does that context sort of add to the mix? More on use cases, also more on cost. We did have council members bring forward alternatives to this that may potentially have been cheaper, and so wanted to circle back on that, and then bring forward the operations group feedback from our discussion with that group in April. Okay, let's see. Whoops. Okay, so I had an opportunity to meet with the crew from BioBot again and just talked a little bit more about, what can be detected. And so their focus primarily right now is on fentanyl and xylazine. There is capability to also test for meth, cocaine, and heroin. So if those are items that we wanted to test for, those are available as well, but they're primarily trying to test for the highest impact and potentially more illicit sort of drugs that are coming into the community. So this was a big conversation that we wanted more clarity on from them, which is how do we really know what we're seeing in this wastewater data in terms of what's prescription use versus illicit use. So there were a couple layers of how BioBot really addresses this concern. The first is that they use prescription data from sample sewer sheds. So Steve from BioBot was talking to me about how they have a number of sewer sheds that they test at to get sort of a prescription baseline. So they have an understanding of what a baseline amount of opioids from prescriptions are in any given community. And then they use that to sort of base their other data projections against that baseline to see if and when there are spikes. another sort of intervention that they play to really try to figure out the distinction between illicit use and prescription drug use showing up in wastewater is to test for whether the ingredients in the drugs are raw or if they've been metabolized. So in talking with their group, getting more understanding around this, raw ingredients in the wastewater would indicate dumping. Sort of a dumping event is sort of described as, the drugs entering the system as part of a byproduct or waste product, which really indicates that someone in that area is doing some illegal drawing these drugs up, production of these illicit drugs. So it really points at the illicit use. And in turn, metabolized drugs really point to consumed drugs. So these are drugs that folks are consuming, and there's going to be a little bit more conversation next about how do you really still figure out if that consumption indicates anything that's illicit versus prescription. Any questions on that? Right. So in terms of use cases, again, the big two that the BioBot crew keeps coming back to is that this allows for measurement of intervention effectiveness and targeting interventions to specific communities, specific events, specific areas. So in terms of measuring intervention effectiveness, so, one thing that their team continues to point out is this is really a great way to measure use. It doesn't exactly tell the same story as some of the other data that we've talked about using, such as OD rates, hospitalizations, or law enforcement encounters. And so one of the examples that their team gave is, you can sort of see in some communities, maybe an OD rate or hospitalization rates might go down. But if your use data stays high and you're continuing to have these spikes, then you could point or paint the story, correlate this to some strong efficacy of reversal interventions, maybe more prevalence of Narcan or naloxone within the community. Another example they gave in terms of targeting interventions, so they mentioned, more about how spikes in dumping are more indicative of illicit drug use and production within a community, and how you can target interventions a little bit more towards those quote unquote dumping spikes. And similarly, metabolized use spikes can also have targeted interventions or resources placed around known events or periods of time in which folks are consuming more opioids and they're showing up in wastewater. So one of the examples their team used was an area that uses this data to really to understand when they have annual events, outdoor concerts, things of that nature, where they do see spikes in metabolized drugs within the wastewater, using that data to then inform having reversal resources, materials, or Narcan and naloxone available at those events in the future. Also talked about an area that planned for these metabolized use spikes by coordinating with local hospital systems and first responders around some of those known events that cause some of these spikes in drug use. In terms of cost, got a little bit more information there as well. So I did mention last month that this was about $50,000 a year for each testing site, and that is inclusive of weekly tests. We also looked into the CSU, Colorado State University, alternative testing, which is about $1,000 per test. So if you did it on the same weekly basis, the price would be comparable. In final conversation with BioBot, they did offer to host a phased pilot with us if we were interested in pursuing this, but not yet totally bought in on diving all in and testing across all of our communities. So making an offer to really work with the Boulder County region to phase in a pilot with strategic testing of specific sites for 6 to 12 months, and really sort of guided digestion of that data to really tie into some of our public health approaches and our opioid strategies. I'm going to pause there and see if there's questions on this additional feedback from BioBot. Yeah, Susan.
Thanks, Kelly. I have a couple questions. So I'm forgetting how many wastewater treatment plants are there in Boulder County?
That is a great question, and I actually don't know the answer to that. I thought last time we discussed it was 3, but
Okay,
anybody on here can correct me if I'm wrong.
I just,
apologize. I'm happy looking
yeah, I
it
was
up.
curious. I'm curious also how they or we would come up with whatever those pilot testing sites would be. I mean, for me, if it's actually 3 sites across Boulder County, and we'd be talking about 150,000 a year to test, this is still interesting to me because I think we have limited resources elsewhere to be able to target interventions or prevention. And I think if we have it's kind of the same way we've talked about when we use the GIS mapping data to try to look at social vulnerability or how we're investing other funds. And so it's still interesting to me. And I would love to hear, since Indira is on, I'd love to hear from Indira and Lexi too on just the plan that you're putting together for the grant. It seems like this information could help to target geographic areas of where you're doing the trainings, some of the outreach, engagement in businesses, those kind of things. So I'd be curious to hear their perspective as well.
Yeah, I think doing the actual testing of the wastewater, first of all, wastewater is the future. So I just want to recognize that. But doing the testing of the wastewater is going to require a lot of internal systems on how we respond. And so I think when we think about the cost of doing the actual test, yes, it seems reasonable, but there has to be a whole response team and infrastructure that's built with it that has to complement what we might be seeing. So those are my only concerns, is that I don't think we have the infrastructure on the back end to be able to handle what we see coming in. But I don't know, Lexi, any thoughts from you?
Just to point out that I'm still, and I see Harold has his hand up too, but I'm still curious about whether there's going to be a discernible advantage to this, having this in addition to ODMAP, particularly in terms of trends. And I'm just a little concerned, given some of the response from the municipalities about what does that 50,000 a year get you, because what I was hearing from the municipalities is that it is a pretty heavy lift for them. And so that infrastructure is not just kind of county infrastructure to make meaning of the data, but also the point of sight support that would be needed. And I'm just not quite clear on what that 50,000 a year includes. And I'll pause there.
Harold?
Yeah, I think what I'm still struggling with this is if you're just doing a single site of testing and it happens to be at your wastewater treatment plant, you just kind of at a certain point go, what can you really glean out of this information? Because in our case, multiple hospitals, multiple clinics, you have the transitory nature of people coming in. So just a holistic testing at your plant actually really, I don't think tells you a lot. In order to get good data to understand what's going on, is it, or you have to go into your sewer trunk system, which significantly increases the cost of what you're trying to do if you're truly going to learn something out of it. I just don't see how you make the transition from testing a whole system to seeing what's going on within your system.
And while people were talking, I Googled how many wastewater treatment plants there are in Boulder County, and it's like 15. Most every municipality has one.
Yeah, not including some of the, well, yeah, I'm assuming that's including the wastewater districts.
Yeah.
It's just when we did the COVID testing and really understanding what does it mean, we could manipulate the data, but we just knew there was a part of this. Who's coming in and out of your community? How are they, at your commercial centers? They could augment you, they could change your testing results. And then who knows what's happening at the hospitals.
Kelly, can you say more about the phased pilot? What would that include and how much would that cost?
I don't have a ton of details about that. That was literally an email that was sent my way from the BioBot team about an hour before today's meeting. And just to say, if and when you do talk about this with the council next, please let them know that we're flexible to, put our heads together and design something that looks more like a phased pilot. Nothing was offered in the way of what that might look like in terms of cost, but happy to look into that more.
And did you say that the state is still considering this or not?
So actually, yeah, this was one point that I wanted to follow up in terms of Indira's response, which is, it mirrors exactly what we had heard from the BioBot team. They have been continuing to work with the AG's office a little bit and CDPHE, and have been getting the response that this is all really interesting. It's all very innovative. However, there's a lot of lacking support internally. I shouldn't say support, capacity really internally to programatize anything that we see from this data. And so I think that's been the resounding kind of feedback that we've heard both from BioBot as well as, any conversations we've had with those connections at CDPHE. And it really, again, echoes what Indira just offered as well. One thing I might offer, and maybe we can revisit this after I also kind of give the feedback from the operations group, is, I think there's a lot of interest in hearing some of these use cases. I feel like the council is, intrigued by some of those use cases, and I would be happy to get more in the weeds on some of those, to get questions like, Harold, to your point of like, how have municipalities or regions in the past really concretely used this information in a tangible way, and to what end? So I'm happy to really get more weedy on that if it's of interest. So that I'll just offer that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's if diving into that, if we could also hear from cities who are doing it and about the resources required, the heavy lift on their end. Just some real time conversations around that. I'd be curious about that.
I think for me, my question is, what's the ROI on this approach?
Yep.
And how much time do we spend on this if there's not a tangible ROI? I think there's some specific use cases when maybe you're identifying areas of the community where you think there's issues and you could be potentially more targeted, but I'm not sure what the ROI is. And how much time do we spend on this if we can't really lay that out and say, here's why it's worth our time?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, again, if talking to some of the counties or cities that are doing this to try to get at that and how they've applied it. Lexi, I see your hand up.
No, I was just going to tag on to Harold's comment just a little bit more. It feels to me like at this beginning stage of really having some resources to invest in the work, I almost feel like we need to be doing the work. And that as we build an infrastructure to do the work, that there may be more opportunities for other funding sources to support. This is an add-on, particularly from the state, or to really be able to produce a persuasive argument that having this data tells us how we're doing in terms of evaluation.
And I think to Lexi's point, the only way I see this working well, especially for us in targeting where it is in the community, is do we need a baseline? Do we do it once and figure out where we're at today? And then we can come back in 6 months or a year and do it again to say, is it any better or any worse? As opposed to the ongoing testing to try to figure out or try to determine locations or areas that we need to work hard on. I think our perspective, and OD map would tell you, it's all over the county. So if we just need a baseline to say, here's where we measured it today, and a year from now, here's where we are now, has the work that we've done in between had any impact? That would be the benefit for me, but the ongoing cost, I agree with Harold, doesn't feel like it's worth the return.
So maybe that's a compromise of saying interested, but maybe not on a weekly basis.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I can get back to this group and see what that offer, that last bullet might look like. And if we want to continue the conversation. And Sheriff Johnson, to your point, I think, yeah, what you're talking about would really, be that first bullet in terms of use case. Like, let's just see if we can use it to measure impact of our interventions over time. And maybe if we're not doing that more frequent testing, we wouldn't be doing it as much to sort of get an idea of those real-time spikes in that kind of second use case category.
And I think with what the sheriff said, in terms of baselining, but I would definitely start including the wastewater professionals to a certain point in this conversation, because they're going to know flow rates, what times a day, maybe most advantageous for testing, to say, what look are you getting in the community? And I just know this because they talk to me and we understand capacities and when capacities are, when the flow rates are high and what we're having to do. And I think not having that knowledge base can really skew the results based on what you're trying to achieve. So at some point, they need to probably get into the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Harold. I think one question that I have just as staff is, at what point does it make sense for me to maybe start making those linkages and either have guest presentations or at least kind of follow the conversation between wastewater professionals and maybe the BioBot crew? I think, the more technical this conversation gets, the more it's out of my wheelhouse, and I want to make sure I'm kind of shepherding the conversation forward in a way that makes sense with the folks with the right expertise. So yeah, thank you for that.
So from those who have spoken, I'm hearing some cynicism about it, or question about the ROI and approach and resources needed. But I'm also hearing enough, well, let me check this. Is there enough interest to just have Kelly continue the conversation without making any decisions and bringing it back to this group? Or do people want to just say, no, we've reviewed this enough and let's stop?
Robin, I'm in a place right now where I would feel okay just letting this go. I think that there's so much work around the services continuum and other things that Kelly and others can be working on and planning ahead for other things. I do have that question after hearing how many sites and the ROI on this. My thought before was, I think it could be helpful if we could do some ongoing testing at all sites to really understand where we're going to target interventions, training, outreach. And I just don't think that the expense makes sense given how many plants there are. So that's just my vote on that, is I would be okay letting this go.
Their comments?
I think if I wouldn't put it at the top of the list and spend a lot of time on it. I would focus on some of the other activities that, you know, we can really document and understand, but, you know, as time permits, I'm not opposed to saying, well, what would it look like if we did it once a year to get a baseline, but I just wouldn't spend a lot of time on it. So if it's easier just to say, let's put this in a parking lot right now, I'm fine with that. Knowing that if we learn something, we can always talk about it.
I agree with Harold.
It seems to me that, Kelly, that circling back to BioBot to find out what a baseline evaluation would cost, and then an annual cost. And then if there's opportunity to learn more, as Harold said, without a lot of, this is not your number one priority, but just stay open to that.
Yeah, that certainly works for me.
Okay. Susan, I appreciate your what you're bringing up in terms of priority and the work plan, the heavy lift that all this work is. So maybe this can be a compromise, just checking out this one or two things and then, bringing it back when it makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I'm thinking I probably should have also presented this before that last conversation, but I think it's sort of the same concerns that just came out in our dialogue. So this is really what the operations group had to say about this opportunity. Definitely, I would use the word skepticism as well with that group. A lot of concerns, data concerns. There are comparable data alternatives that are already in use and not being utilized most optimally. So maybe we should dedicate our resources there, our time and attention to really figuring out how to take those data sources already and do more of that programmatic lift and response. And also just some concern that it's again, what is it telling us in terms of an actionable strategy, an actionable story about what's going on in our community. So some concerns about what the data could really paint for us coming out in this group conversation. And then also cost and process concerns. Susan, to your point, a lot of what the group said is, we've had a long ongoing conversation in this group where we've held difficult discussions about making cuts to this program to allow for more funding for that program, and even getting those initial 25 shovel-ready programs through that first funding drop. It was really difficult. It took a lot of work for us to kind of pare down some of those funding asks to really be within our actual allowance for that year's funding drop. And so their concern was, it would seem a little unfair to now forward a very costly, definitely very expensive initiative forward to the front of the line and sort of bypass that ongoing process that the operations group has largely held and dedicated a lot of time, passion, and energy to. And so that was one of the concerns that the group had. So I'll pause again and see if there's any additional questions or reflections from what the operations group had to say.
Not seeing any, Kelly. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pass it off to Robin to talk about reflections on the work of this council so far.
Great. So we thought it was a good time for a check-in with the ROC to make sure that we're facilitating and managing these meetings to meet your expectations. We have some prompt questions, but we don't have to go specifically in this order or direction. But overall, we want to know what's working so far with our meetings. Is there something we should be doing that you thought we would be doing when you signed on to serve as a council member? How can this time that we spend, it's valuable time, how can we make sure that we're also a filter for new and emerging issues that folks want to bring to the table? And then how do we support council members who would really like to formally inform the meeting agendas, which are mainly staff driven at this point, as well as with the input of our subject matter experts on the opioids operations group. So I wanted to note that Nuria sent us an email earlier today with her thoughts about this. If you haven't a chance to review that, be sure that you read that. I asked Commissioner Levy to also send me her thoughts in response to these questions as well. So just like to open the floor to anyone who would like to provide some feedback or reflections on any of these questions.
Robin, I can share. I appreciated Nuria's feedback or her input. Oh, sorry, Lexi, you had your hand up. I didn't put my hand up. Okay. I have some of those same questions just on the intersection between this work and some of the behavioral health roadmap work. I also appreciate that this year was really about getting some of the money out the door, and that what my understanding is the goal of the group, of the operations group, is to really look at the continuum of services and to be able to share what are gaps moving forward from their perspective. And so I know that that work will be coming. And I think what's working really well, I really appreciated the agendas and the way that things are presented and the opportunity to weigh in. So just from a process perspective, I really appreciated the way that Kelly, I think mostly you are presenting the information. So yeah, I would just add that I had similar questions that Nuria had, and I know that it's a huge lift to try to map out all of the services that are happening, all the funding sources. So just want to acknowledge that too, that I think her suggestion was to do that. It's really helpful if we can do that. But I think it's a hard thing to get a really comprehensive look at.
Thanks for that, Susan. Lexi?
Just an idea that I'm wondering if there might be value to our consultants, for our consultants to be in contact, particularly with our Metro Denver partners in this space, to have a good sense of what they're doing in terms of investments. There could be, economies of scale to be gained. There could be some leverage opportunities. There could be, amazing innovation ideas that we just haven't come across yet, or lessons learned about what's working and what's not.
Yeah, that's great. And I think related to that idea, as well as to Susan and Nuria's questions about the relationship with the behavioral health roadmap, the roadmap is a plan, so they're not doing any work in this arena. They got a lot of community feedback, subject matter expert, people with lived experience, agencies, providers, treatment providers, criminal justice, and certainly concerns around opioid use and all those related issues to opioid use came up in a way that won't surprise anyone. I don't think anything's going to come out in the plan that would change our work or our direction. We know that this work needs to align with the behavioral health work, and it also has its own pathway because it's with the IGA, with the state and the AG. So we will be bringing that plan to the commissioners mid-July. And many of us are involved in the executive advisory board that will be seeing a sneak preview before that, I think second week in June. So in case that's helpful. Harold, do you have your hand up?
I was about to, I'm thinking a little bit, I think and this is really probably more born out of a conversation that I had with Lexi a while back, in terms of when we're looking at things that we want to do, is maybe diving a little bit into potentially unintended consequences of what we're doing, and what that really means for specific communities. And, you know, are we doing something that could inadvertently create a different challenge for communities? I think the example I used was issues that we're seeing in our parks and, you know, our Little League teams, and not wanting to utilize them because of drug-related materials in the playing fields, and seeing where that's coming from, and just kind of, you know, checking ourselves as we're going through some of these options to go, you know, are we doing something that could have an unintended consequence that we haven't thought about, and just dive into that a little bit more.
Kelly, I think we lost your slide deck.
I just noticed that. Let me throw that back up there. Sorry about that.
Harold, can you help me understand a little bit more about what that might look like in this realm? The work that we are doing and how that would have an unintended consequence for Longmont, per se.
Well, I mean, I think it's more, you know, it's more direct when we talk about harm reduction supplies, and, you know, what our folks are, who have, you know, they're out maintaining facilities and interacting with individuals. And when they see it, they're like, well, where are you getting this? And they said, well, we're getting it from, you know, the harm reduction programs. And, you know, if we're going to do that, how are we talking to folks about, you know, be cognizant of how you're utilizing these, don't just leave them in public areas. And that's just feedback I'm getting from operations groups at different levels that are out talking to individuals. So it's more of what's the potential unintended consequences, and then how can we work to ensure that we're minimizing those to the best of our ability? Because it just in turn creates a different issue that we're having to deal with other aspects of our community. And I think that ties into the community involvement whenever we're doing something as well, you know, understanding what sector of the community, where are we going to be, and maybe diving in a little bit with those areas of the community in terms of whether it's a business group or a residential group, to try to understand their perspectives as well. Otherwise, that's just going to come back at us. And then as a municipality, we're then having to deal with it in a different way.
Yep. That's really helpful, and it reminds me of the racial equity impact assessment that the county does. And Kelly, I'm thinking about, you know, when project proposals come in, you know, maybe there's a question about who will be most burdened by this, or what are the unintended consequences of this project on different sectors, or something like that. I haven't fully thought it through, but I think it's an interesting question to grapple with.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, yeah, the REACT tool is perfectly, it's a great example of a tool to draw those conversations out. You know, how can we mitigate some of these unintended consequences or impacts to certain communities or populations? So I think it drives an important conversation. So I think it would be really interesting to include either use of the REACT or other, you know, comparable tools in the work that Third Horizon helps us develop around those strategic priorities, and that funding framework piece to include it in that. So yeah, thanks, Robin.
Lexi, I see your hand up.
I know, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot today. No, I think Harold's point is well taken, that some of the problems that we're up against are really complex right now. And they have multiple effects on multiple sectors. I think the meth conversation we've been having recently, meth remediation, is a great example of how big an impact that it has on housing authorities. And just being really conscious that the space where we are in a lot of this opioid work right now requires an intersectoral, community engaged approach, because there are too many folks that are affected by the decisions that get made in programming, not to not only have buy-in across the board, but to make sure that we're considering a multiplicity of impacts and spaces. So just reinforcing that, and it's beyond the equity issue. It goes all the way into kind of other sectors being able to achieve their own goals and demonstrate stewardship, et cetera.
Well, I think that's a great point, Lexi. Many of the things I'm referencing, I probably wouldn't have brought up 3 years ago because we didn't have the housing authority under our purview. And now we do. And so, we're learning real time in terms of what we need to think about. So I think that's a great point.
Any other comments about our meetings and your roles in our meetings? Is there interest in having the council weigh in on the agenda items? You're always welcome to add agenda items, but maybe we need to put in a system where we could actively invite you. And, or as Susan mentioned, maybe the agendas have been just fine. So really want to hear your input about that piece as well. Thanks, Harold, for your note. And thank you, Anjali. Well, I do want to maybe it's helpful for you to know what is our current process. Kelly definitely does the heavy lift around preparing for the meetings and facilitating the meetings. The ops board also weighs in, and so there's real-time perspective about what's happening on the ground that might float up to an agenda item. Kelly, Jim, and I meet before the meetings to draft the agenda items based on all of the intel that we have. And I think, if I reflect on the missing piece for me is I really want to make sure there's a pathway in to our monthly meetings to hear about what issues the council members are hearing, like Harold referenced. So what's going on in your agency, your municipalities, or what are you hearing from the community members that might need to be discussed at this meeting? And you could certainly float any one of us, a question about it or a comment that we could turn into an agenda item. So again, I just want to make sure that people are aware that that's available to you. Any more to say on any of these questions or? Okay, I think our last few minutes we have, if there are any updates, and a reminder about a statewide conference. If you're interested in attending. Kelly, did you want to tee that up a little more gracefully than I just did?
Yeah, no worries. So we do have the annual conference. This is put on by the AG's office. So it's the 16th through the 18th. It's in Montrose. And so we have had, well, I've been hearing a little bit of, interest from staff members, folks in the community that want to attend. And so this is maybe not something we need to solve for today, but just wondering if the council wanted to weigh in on, who we're putting forward to officially represent the region. I'm assuming there's a cap on the number of attendees. So, to whatever degree we can be thoughtful about putting forward, representatives for our region. That might be something that this council wants to chew on. So just sort of a queue up for that.
Thanks for that. I also wanted to ask the council, we're having a really hard time finding a date in July for our meeting. And so one option would be to cancel the meeting, but I'm also aware that we will be coming up to our next round of funding applications. And Kelly, I wondered what you thought about what would happen for the timing of that if we cancel June, and if we could tackle that conversation in July.
So cancel June or cancel July? Was it June?
I'm sorry, cancel July.
Okay. I was like, well, if we're canceling June, I have a different answer. So canceling July to me sounds okay. I think some of the work that's coming forward in terms of timeline will have a lot to do with what comes out of our continued work with Third Horizon. So I could see, the time between now and our June meeting being really productive in terms of getting that work plan together, getting some plans for community convenings in place, and having, a lot of that to sort of chew on in June. July would be fine to take off, in my opinion. I don't have any major milestones. However, to Jim's point from earlier, if we do want to cancel July, we should have our August meeting pretty early, because we'll be kind of upon that timing of RFPs going out for funding and wanting to review our strategies and make sure everything's sort of packaged and in place by midsummer, really.
Thanks for that. Any comments about canceling July? People okay with that? And then we'll look for dates for early August. Anybody speak now or forever hold your peace, or whatever that phrase is?
I may just be hit or miss during August with budget process, so, but that is what it is.
It is, yeah, we are all in the same boat. Okay, well, I think we're done. So really appreciate the engagement today and the conversation and the feedback, and take good care of yourselves in this troubled world we live in, and we'll see you in June.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye.